going to get started. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Global Forum here at the House. Global Forum is a student-led organization dedicated to promoting global understanding, awareness, and citizenship throughout UCSD and the communities it serves through public lectures, events, and discussions like this one. And tonight we are pleased to welcome Professors Richard Carney and Terence for our discussion on Southeast Asia, democracy, development, and economic crises. So before we begin, a couple of announcements. Next week, because of the President's Day holiday, we will not be having a Monday night event. But we will be having two special events that are going to be right here in the Great Hall. The first is on Tuesday, February 17th from 1 to 2:30 p.m. here. The comedian Maz Dubrani will be coming as a part of his book signing and comedy tour to promote his new book, I'm Not a Terrorist, but I Played One on TV. So his memoir is about his experiences making his way as a comedian of Middle Eastern descent in a post 9/11 market. So how did he make his way as a comedian and as an actor without having to get kicked in the face by Chuck Norris? So that'll be fun and entertaining, and also because seating is going to be limited, we recommend that you register online. The website link is right there on the flyer, and it should also be on the quarter sheet posters that you saw at the front desk. So don't forget, next Tuesday. And then, next Thursday, the Global Forum at iHouse is co-sponsoring an event with the Center on Emerging and Pacific Economies entitled China's Incursion into Latin America, Myths and Realities. Each day we hear about how China in the news is making inroads financially into the different economies of Latin America, and what is going on. Are they messing around with U.S. interests, or is it just plain business? The former Mexican ambassador to China will be coming to speak on that event, and it'll be quite entertaining. Also, because that event will have limited seating, we highly recommend that you register online at Eventbrite. The link is on the on the flyer and on our quarter sheet at the front of the table. So that is next Thursday, 5 to 6:30, right here at the Great Hall. Finally, don't forget to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or check out our new blog site to keep up with all of our upcoming events. And also be sure to check out register for our e-newsletter. So without further ado, let us welcome to the stage Professor Terence Gomez.
Today. I'd like to thank Global Forum for inviting me to speak at this function. The topic I'm going to discuss today is on, it will deal with issues pertaining to models of development that have been employed in Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia is a region, as you know, which has industrialized very rapidly. The rate of growth of that economy has been so phenomenal that it has been referred to as the East Asian miracle by the World Bank. So what actually happened? I'd like to take you back into history to show you how that growth occurred. I will take you through the crisis in 1997, talk about the reforms that were introduced, and then I'll take you through to 2008 when we had the global financial crisis, and bring you up to date. My topic today is this: why is it that things have not changed since that significant event in 1997 when we were exposed to this great financial crisis? The starting point first is this: there have been two major events. When we look at development in Southeast Asia, the two key events that come up to mind is first, the 2008 financial crisis. This brought the economies to the brink of collapse, particularly here in North America and in Europe, but it had serious implications also in Southeast Asia. This crisis brought to mind the model of growth that we refer to in the literature as neoliberalism. The next model, which was also, this was not the first time we had this crisis, as I said. The other model, which we refer to a lot in the literature, is called the developmental state model. When we had the 1997 Asian crisis, the Asian currency crisis, the model was brought into question. So here we have seen both models which have been employed in these economies, which have been put there out in the forefront in terms of debates as to first how did we get there and where do we go from here. But first let me explain these models to you. Let me define these models to you. The developmental state. The defining characteristic of the developmental state is that it calls for great state intervention in the economy. The core concern in this model is the need for the state to work very closely with business. There is a cooperation between these two to help drive these economies. But it's the state that comes up with the public policies, the state that dictates the agenda. The state is the one that determines which areas of the economy should be industrialized. So it's a state-driven agenda. The key features of the East Asian model is that you have a rather autonomous bureaucracy, or even a political system that is, political elites who are rather autonomous. The other issue, as I said, is public-private cooperation. The third issue is, and this is very important, the tripartite link between banks, the state, and industries. The coming together, state, capital, and the industrial sector to drive the growth. This has been one of the key features of East Asia, how the industrial sector has worked very closely with the financial sector to drive this growth, but dictated by the state. The other issue, which is of great importance, is the emphasis on education. In these countries, you will find that education was stressed mainly because you needed to create the kind of human capital that could move into this kind of rapidly industrializing country. But the final issue, which is also of importance here, is this. A social compact was created between state, capital, and labor. I'm stressing this point about labor. Labor was important. Trade unions were important. They listened to labor. So social compact was created, which served as a very important driver of this kind of growth. The first country that introduced this was Japan. Japan is interesting because after the Second World War, Japan's economy was completely devastated. This was a country that had to grow, rebirth. We had to see the rebirth of this country's economy. This country had already laid the foundation, but the fact is that country, within a span of just 30 years after the Second World War, had emerged as the second largest economy in the world, second only to the United States. So what was this about Japan? There was this fantastic growth. The developmental state model has been used to describe what happened in Japan. So if you want to understand Japan, you've seen the features of Japan. What were the features that were introduced in this developmental state model which helped drive the growth? The second generation of newly industrialized countries in East Asia were Korea and Taiwan. You can include Singapore here too. Korea and Taiwan was interesting because both these countries, in fact you can include Singapore too, all three countries were extremely poor. In the 1960s, if you look at East Asia, these countries were really dirt poor. Korea was dirt poor. South Korea, it was nothing compared to North Korea. Taiwan was extremely poor. Southeast Asia was the third generation. After Korea and Taiwan industrialized, we had the third generation of industrialized countries, and here we have Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand. These countries also, interestingly enough, were poor countries. One of the features for all these countries, in fact, was the level of poverty in these countries. I'd like to stress this point. The interesting outcome of the developmental state, when it was introduced, the idea was to industrialize these economies. The idea was not about eradicating poverty, but the fact that this level of industrialization had also managed to reduce poverty to such an extent. If you go to Japan and Korea and Taiwan, and if you see the rates of poverty in these countries and how it has been reduced, this is really remarkable. And if you look at poverty rates in Southeast Asian countries too, look at Singapore, for example, extremely poor in the 1950s, 1960s, and look at Singapore today. One of the most industrialized countries in the world with a GDP per capita which is one of the highest in the world. It was for these reasons the World Bank christened these countries. They referred to them as the East Asian miracle. This is an important phenomenon. We had not seen this before in economic history. But while they used the overriding term of the developmental state to describe all these countries, there were fundamental differences. These fundamental differences can be more specifically seen in the business systems that were introduced in these countries. In South Korea, the focus was on big business, chaebols, family-owned enterprises which were nurtured by the state. Park Chung-hee identified these companies, recognized them as being entrepreneurial, generated a lot of rents, and created these thriving conglomerates. Samsung, Hyundai, Kia, these are companies which are all known to you. Lucky Gold Star, LG. These were companies that were nurtured by the state. In Japan, they had a different model. They didn't have these family, they had the Zaibatsu system, which was family-based. But the real driver of growth was the Keiretsu system, an interlocking relationship involving banks and industrial companies. The banks at the center, and around them industrial companies, big and small, in an interlocking ownership pattern that helped drive the growth. A completely different business system. In Taiwan, when Chiang Kai-shek took over Taiwan, his focus was on creating SMEs. And if you look at Taiwan today, the real drivers for growth were SMEs. 98% of the corporate sector constitutes SMEs. In Singapore, the driver of growth of this industrialization was the GLCs, what we call the government-linked companies. Then a shift to more small and medium-scale enterprises later. In Malaysia, the focus was on creating GLCs, and then big businesses under Mahathir Mohamad, and now the focus is on SMEs. The important point as to why these countries had different systems, business systems, is actually political. In the case of Taiwan, Chiang Kai-shek was worried about, he had been kicked out of China. He had moved into Taiwan. He was worried about the rise of big capital that could be a threat to the KMT, the Kuomintang, his party. So his focus really was on SMEs, which in a way would, as he saw it, would not be a major threat. But he had politically linked companies as well as state-owned enterprises that were also the big drivers of growth too. But the real focus was on creating land reforms and promoting SMEs, which turned out to be quite a good model in Singapore. If you look at Singapore, in the immediate post-colonial period, if you look at Southeast Asia, and if you look at where were the biggest companies in Southeast Asia situated, they were situated in Singapore. But these big businesses, Chinese-owned enterprises, these big businesses were not supportive of Lee Kuan Yew's party, the PAP. They were more supportive of the Socialist Front, the Partisan Socialist. So in effect, what you do see is the state suppressed big businesses by creating GLCs, which became the key players in the economy. And then later, when they began to realize that they had killed off much of that entrepreneurial spirit that was existing, then a shift now to SMEs. In Malaysia, the main party, the United Malays National Organization, worried about Chinese businesses, promoted the rise of GLCs as a counterforce, and the GLCs today remain a big force in the economy. So in all contexts, you will see that politics did shape the kind of business systems that were introduced in these countries. But the other thing that you should also remember about these countries is that they didn't have a similar political system. Japan was democratic. Korea was authoritarian under Park and became democratic. Taiwan was authoritarian under Chiang, became democratic. Thailand was democratic, became authoritarian, democratic now. Well, now back to authoritarian. Indonesia was authoritarian, now democratic. And Malaysia and Singapore, persistently authoritarian. So that's an important difference. The political context is important in terms of where they stand, in terms of the politics and how the politics informed corporate development, which informed the pattern of growth of these economies. So the developmental state agenda, the developmental state term has to be deconstructed and looked at carefully. Now, while all this was going on in the 1960s, 1970s, but really in the 1970s, a new model of development also began to emerge. This model was referred to as neoliberalism. Now, neoliberalism was a term which was primarily motivated by the rise of, or pushed by the rise of conservative politicians in Britain and the United States. First Margaret Thatcher in 1979, and then Ronald Reagan. Both of them had one key idea in mind: the need to reduce the presence of the state in the economy. as he said, the government has no business being in business. So the idea of neoliberalism was, the primary idea behind it was the retreat of the state, to get the state out of the economy. And to do that, one of the things that he began to advocate in a big way was economic liberalization. Promote the private sector as the primary engine of growth. Deregulate the economy. So deregulation became the key big mantra. The other big mantra was privatization. If you look at Britain, privatization was one of the key public policies that was introduced under Margaret Thatcher. But there was another fundamental difference between neoliberalism and the developmental state. How they viewed labor. If you look at neoliberal practices, and this is just the primary characteristics, but one of the key issues, both for Margaret Thatcher as soon as she came to power, was to go after the mining union, and for Reagan it was to go after the airlines union. You can see a suppression on workers. Workers now become commodities, and subsequently consumers. So if you look at Southeast Asia, and if you look at the developmental model, the most important thing here is that the idea of pragmatism, the mix between fundamentally different models of development. And these models of development were subscribed to and introduced into these economies. And you can see them running through the developmental plan of these countries. The interesting thing here is this. Let's promote the rise, let's follow the Japanese model and promote the rise of domestic enterprises. Let's industrialize these economies. But there was one fundamental difference between Japan, Korea, and Taiwan as compared to Southeast Asia. In Japan, Korea, and Southeast Asia, in Japan and Korea and Taiwan, the dependence on foreign investments, foreign direct investments to drive the economy was not as great as what we see or what we saw in Southeast Asia. In Southeast Asia, the real drivers of industrialization were foreign investors, FDI. And in Malaysia and Indonesia also, you can see this great emphasis on developing conglomerates, huge companies. And you will see that one of the key interesting events of Southeast Asia by the 1980s, that the major companies, the leading enterprises in Southeast Asia were no longer from Singapore. They were from Thailand, Indonesia, and one could say Malaysia too. And here too, you can see one of the processes which was used to develop this was privatization. The other mechanism that was used to create these conglomerates was the stock market. One of the key features of the stock market was the emphasis, one of the key features of neoliberalism was the emphasis on the stock market. If you look at Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia, the key factor here was the rise of the stock market and the deployment of the stock market to help create these large companies at a very rapid rate. So here you can see the fostering of a US style of using the stock market to develop this kind of huge enterprises that they wanted. But they were also well aware that this was not the case in Japan. Japan didn't follow this model. The Japan stock market was not really, the interlocking relationship in the Keiretsu didn't allow for the stock market to be a key player in that sense. And Singapore was not interested in this too. So again here you can see the differences in these countries in terms of how they employed certain institutions and tools to create these large companies. Now the point here really is this, the role of the financial sector. When we talk about neoliberalism, the first thing we want to know is what is the role of the financial sector. The point here is also this, when we talk about the developmental state, the financial sector was a key component. The state used its control over the financial sector to drive this industrialization process. The state used the financial sector to pass on rents to companies that were selectively patronized so that they can drive this industrialization process. Neoliberalism is different. In the neoliberal case, the financial sector is controlled by private enterprises. So you can see here two different models, but the key focus was who had ownership and control of the financial sector. And in East Asia, one of the most interesting things is that the state retained large control over the financial sector. How it was used is interesting also because in terms of political patronage, because the idea of selective patronage to create large enterprises that can be the real domestic drivers of growth in this economy, that was the agenda. selective patronage to create these companies. These companies will now be internationally renowned. They will be major companies around the world. And why shouldn't they believe in them? After all, Japan did it, Korea did it, and look at where Japan and Korean companies are today. Japanese companies are world renowned for some of their brand products, so too with Korea. So the idea in Southeast Asia also it could be done. But apart from FDI to drive these growths, one of the key other drivers that they required was two things: an emphasis on foreign loans and a focus on FPI, foreign portfolio investments. Unlike FDI, which can be extremely productive and can create enterprises and can generate employment, FPI is not. FPI is about money invested in the stock market. It becomes an avenue through which you can raise funds which can help drive this growth, create companies very quickly which are extremely large. And so you see a huge inflow now of loans and FPI into these countries. If you look at Malaysia, little Malaysia, by the mid-1990s had the 15th largest stock market in the world. Then Prime Minister, I remember one morning, proudly announcing in Parliament that there was more stock trading on the Kuala Lumpur Stock Exchange than there was on the New York Stock Exchange. What a remarkable feat. In Korea, Korea had the 9th largest stock market in the world by the mid-1990s. In Indonesia, in terms of equity market capitalization as per percentage of GDP, it went from 2.4% to 22.8% within a span of just a few years, 4 years. And in Thailand, during the same period, it increased by threefold. So the emphasis on the stock market to drive this growth is very interesting in terms of how it helped precipitate the rise of these companies very quickly. Meanwhile, on the issue of politics, the conduct of power, what was happening? The interesting thing about the state was how the state was operating at multiple levels. And you could see it in terms of how it operated through the GLCs. The state was operating also through the hegemonic party. The state was also operating through a very strongman kind of executive, influential politicians. All of them had their own interest in terms of the kinds of companies that they wanted to foster. So there were interesting things happening in the state in terms of who they were directing their attention to. And it was their own personal interest in many ways that determined the kind of companies that came up and who got access to these rents. But it was still growing. They were productive in the sense that the rents were given out, these companies were investing, it was growing, but the issue was who dictated the agenda. And here again, that means you need to deconstruct the state to find out who are the key players who really are determining who got what rents from the state. The important point here was this. The state, because of its different manifestations, undermined the neutrality of public policy planning and implementation. The way public policies were planned, there was no such thing as a neutral state. This idea of this neutral state that will implement policies in the interest of the economy perished a thought. That was not happening. Selective patronage when it was happening, ostensibly to create domestic firms because you need to create these large enterprises, were being determined in a non-transparent manner. The concept of selective patronage. Again, the idea of picking winners like Korea did. Yes, Korea did pick winners, they did become major companies based on entrepreneurial capacity. Those were not the same criteria that was used by companies in Southeast Asia to determine who got the rents from the state. And then it all fell apart. Until 1997, many developing countries began to come to Southeast Asia to look upon this region, to marvel at its enormous growth. How did they do it? It was the model to be replicated. And then in 1997, the rapid dismantling, as rapidly as they rose, the fall was even faster. And here, immediately it was back to the drawing board. The idea was about accountability. The idea was about corporate governance. We need to bring about reforms. So the following matters are crucial. If you want to understand 1997, you must understand the role of the state. I'm not going to go into the details today. It's not my purpose, but I just want to draw out your attention to this point. Understand the role of the state. The state was the key driver of growth. But the state was not necessarily following one model of development. You can see a mix and match of policy ideas. whatever it takes to get these companies to grow, whatever it takes to get these economies to grow. But underlining that was also concepts of patronage and corruption, massive corruption. When the crisis happened, the big issue was, what is the role of the state? The role of the state also became important because the GLCs, interestingly enough, were used to bail out some of these large enterprises. The presence of the state after the crisis became even greater in some countries. But the other issue was also about regulation. It became clear that regulation mattered. And the idea was that the regulators were caught sleeping. Actually, it is not true. The here was the concept of the revolving door. You will see people coming in and going out, coming into the corporate sector, coming in from the corporate sector, being part of the political system, and going out. It's a concept which you see very liberally used in Latin America. The idea of regulatory capture, the idea of state capture. One of the most important things that happened after the rise of democracy, with the fall of the strong state, was that big companies that had emerged became key players, not just in the economy, but also within the political system. So when democracy came to East Asia and Southeast Asia, what you will see is that big businesses tried to capture control of the state. They formed political parties. In Korea, there was an attempt even by the chairman of Hyundai to run for the presidency. In Thailand, when democracy came, one key player who emerged was a man who had benefited significantly from rents from the state under authoritarian rule, Thaksin Shinawatra. He created a party, the Thai Party, used that party and his money to win, first to buy over people into the party, and subsequently to use that money to buy over votes. Then he comes to power and then he creates policies which benefits the people, especially in the rural north, and he has a strong base now. So the influence of money now in democratized Southeast Asia is very interesting. The role of the state had changed, or the nature of the state had changed. This is an important point that we must remember, the transitions also when we see from authoritarian rule to democracy. Who became now the strong man within the state? Who had control of the state after democracy came? And here we were in Southeast Asia, hankering after democracy, and democracy came. And when democracy came, the most interesting thing that happened after democracy came was that corruption became worse. Corruption became worse after democracy came because now there was greater distribution of power to some extent. You can make that argument. There was some devolution of power too, which meant that corruption now began to permeate once before it was centralized at the top. It began to permeate down in these countries. So one of the hallmarks of greater democracy in Southeast Asia was increasing corruption. Now these were the issues that were being debated after 1997 too. Regulation matters. We got to worry about this issue of the revolving door. We got to worry about regulatory capture. We got to worry about state capture. Who has got control of this? How do they capture control of the state? How do they fund the politicians? And once they come into power, and especially if you have big businesses now capturing control of the state, what kind of policies do we get? Do we get more neoliberal policies? So while there had to be a discussion about regulation, my argument was we didn't really see major changes. They talked about corporate governance. There was a whole slew of corporate governance ideas which was introduced. The ideas were about controlling the board of directors, but it was not about real reform of these companies, about real devolution of power and to ensure checks and balances in the system to make sure that this doesn't happen. The real reason why we didn't see any real change was this nexus between politics and business. Well, the nexus between politics and business explains the state-business linkage, explains the rapid industrialization that we saw. It also explains why we didn't see reforms that occurred. State capture of democracies, as I mentioned earlier, was a key problem which had not been addressed. And authoritarian regimes, meanwhile, like Malaysia and Singapore, and at one point to Indonesia, when they saw democracy emerging in these countries, and they saw Taiwan falling, Korea falling to democracy, Thailand falling, there was great concern. How do we deal with this domino effect of democracy? How do we justify our form of authoritarian rule? It is at that point in time also we saw the debates emerging about Asian values, an Asian democracy, that they had a different kind of system in place. But it didn't work. In 1997, the idea of Asian democracy, Asian values, the idea that people are very subservient to their leaders, they're very respectful of leaders, all this fell apart in 1997 when the crisis occurred. The real reforms didn't occur because of who still had control over the state and whether, the important point, they had the political will to bring about this change. The political will was not there. So what then of the rise of the middle class? The middle class that had been in the forefront of change. Why didn't the middle class bring about these reforms that we are talking about? There was state discourse about accountability. And while there was this discourse about state accountability, the interesting thing was that they incorporated the social activists into this discourse. But this process of co-optation was very interesting because by making them part of the discourse, key leaders, key people who had control over the state could actually dictate the kind of reforms that we're going to introduce. So it was a sort of paradox when you bring them in, but then when they talk about the reforms, they were reinscribing forms which allowed them to still capture control over the state, over rents, which allowed for this process for enriching themselves. The other important point is this too. The middle class was not very keen about ideas of greater state intervention in the economy. Greater state intervention in the economy, as far as they could see from history, had led to the rise of enormous corruption. And they wanted a more liberal economy. The idea that the state should play a bigger role was not something they would subscribe to because they actually said, we prefer a more deregulated system. They prefer a system in which the state is not a key player in the economy. The state had played such an enormous role in the economy that the middle class view of it was also, I don't think this is the kind of system, I don't think I want a new model of development where the state still looms large. So the debates were also going on among the middle class. The middle class was split, you know. There was a great split in the middle class in terms of what should be the role of the state and what kind of model of development we should have. The split in the middle class also explains much of the problems in terms of why they didn't play that reformist role that one would have expected of a highly informed middle class. So in authoritarian Singapore, for example, you can see again differences. Authoritarian Singapore can control neoliberalism, they can control foreign capital, they can dictate the agenda. But that was not the case in Malaysia. Malaysia is interesting because in the government and the opposition both subscribe to neoliberal ideas. Opposition now was controlled by the former finance minister who had introduced many of these ideas, Anwar Ibrahim. Till now he is the opposition leader. So if you look at the policy agenda from the government and from the opposition in Malaysia, there's no difference. And in fact, interestingly enough, both of them espouse Islamic values. And they espouse Islamic values because the economic agenda that they have been promoting does not bring about the kind of equity that we are seeing, that we would expect to see. In fact, what we do see is still the great marginalization of the poor. The people who are most left behind are still the poor, and you can see that they are at the forefront in terms of articulating the need for a new kind of developmental agenda. But with both coalitions subscribing to the same policy agenda, the way they get around it is by trying to espouse a religious-based agenda. So both of them seem to come across as being extremely religious in terms of how they view these things. Thailand, the business elites are extremely split. You can see a split among the elites in Thailand, the business elites. And you can also see a split in terms of Thailand, in terms of spatial split between the rural north, poor, still not as industrialized as the south or Bangkok. So you can see different cleavages now clearly manifesting themselves in this country. Indonesia. Indonesia is an anomaly because business elites did try to capture control of the state. You saw that even in the last election. Prabowo's attempt to capture control of the state with the backing of a lot of big businesses. Fortunately, it didn't happen. Jokowi comes to power, but it's not so simple. Jokowi also seems to have his own problems, as we can see now what's happening in Indonesia. But here the point is, an interesting thing about Indonesia was the rise of social movements which did not get enmeshed into these debates. They stood apart, and they have become a great critic, especially about corruption, and including now about what's happening in Indonesia in terms of who are getting the most rents. So, what do we see now in Southeast Asia? A highly divided nation. Across the country, you can see highly divided nations, most clearly manifested in elections. If you look at the recent election results, just over the past few years, Malaysia and Indonesia, the electorate is equally split. If you look at Thailand, it is severely fractured, spatially, as well as clear problems in terms of elections, whether they should even have elections. Because you know the outcome if you have an election. Thaksin-backed parties will win. And if you look at Singapore, the dominant party, the PAP, the dominant party is also losing power. This party, which brought about great industrialization, is also the party now fearful of the next election because it will probably do very badly in the next election. Again, a repercussion of form of economic development and the people making a stand in terms of what they see as to what's happening in the country, and they are clearly stating they are not happy with what's going on in Singapore. So the key issue now, the debate, it's about public policies. We need to have a big debate about public policies. We need to have a real agenda about where do we go from here. The situation does look quite bad in all these countries. But the problem also is that the middle class is quite split. This big split among the middle class in terms of policy direction, how we should go forward, seems to be a hindering factor too. The other hindering factor is also about politicians and their subservience to business. The idea of funding. And meanwhile, the poor remain marginalized. A sad state of affairs, which clearly indicates the necessity for dialogue, for discourses about public policies and where we go from here. The big debate is who is going to initiate the debate. Is there this will to bring about a debate, to bring about real change, where we will have an equitable form of economic growth in this region? Thank you.
Professor Richard Carney.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk about the great transformation in Southeast Asia, hopefully reminding you of the title of Paul Anyi's book, The Great Transformation, which talks about the double movement which occurred in response to financial globalization and the effort by social groups, I guess, to dampen the effects that occurred with increasing liberalization or financial globalization, as we might refer to it today. Okay. So here I just want to show you a global distribution of regime types across the world from 1950 to 2006. And one of the most surprising trends in global politics is that the third wave of democratization, which occurred around the collapse of the Soviet Union and gave way to the rise of democracies from 1990 to 1995, as you can see by this line here, stalled in the mid-90s. But what's surprising is the spread of one-party regimes since then, which includes dominant party regimes and single-party regimes, especially dominant party regimes. Dominant party regimes are defined as regimes which have a single political party at the same time with opposition political parties, but that dominant political party rarely gives up control. Malaysia and Singapore are examples of this. Single-party regimes are those which do not permit opposition political parties. An example of that would be China or Vietnam. So the question is, why? Why have dominant party regimes become so stable and spread across the world since the end of the third wave of democratization? So this is a big puzzle. And I would like to offer an argument based on evidence from Southeast Asia to explain partly why this is occurring. So one of the major trends that has occurred at the same time as the spread and stability of one-party regimes has been the rise in gross private capital flows, or basically financial globalization is another way of describing this. And you can see here that these red lines correspond to the third wave of democratization, but that it continues to rise even after that, corresponding to the spread of one-party regimes. And so I'm going to argue, and here I just present another puzzle, but I'm going to argue that one-party regimes have two particular institutional attributes that make them particularly well-suited to offering stability in the presence of a highly financially globalized world. Before the Asian financial crisis of 1997, Singapore, among the countries that you can see here, Singapore had by far the greatest number of state-owned companies that were publicly listed. And this should not be too surprising. I'm going to tell you a little bit more in a moment. But Singapore, more than any of these other countries, was exposed to the pressures of financial globalization. In fact, it was the most vulnerable and encountered this vulnerability during the 1970s and into the beginning of the 1980s. And so part of its reaction was the creation of the Global Investment Corporation in 1981, one of its two sovereign wealth funds, as a mechanism by which to stabilize itself. And so I'll argue in a moment that this spike in the proportion of state-owned companies in Singapore should come as no surprise. But what's interesting is when we look at 2008. Oops. Now Malaysia has the highest proportion of firms with state ownership. And of course, Malaysia and Singapore are the only two countries that are one-party regimes of the countries listed here. And I'll argue it's no accident. This is not an accident that these two countries in particular have such high levels of state ownership. And of course, they weathered the Asian financial crisis intact in comparison to Indonesia and Thailand, whose regimes collapsed. So the argument starts. Let me present to you my argument. So if you imagine a regime with a central political authority and you have political leaders, this is in the context of an emerging economy. So in an emerging economy, generally speaking, there are weak institutions. And when you have weak institutions, you need to rely on political leaders to create deals with business owners to assure them that their property rights will be protected in order to encourage them to make investments to grow the economy so that the government can obtain tax revenue. But the problem with these political leaders creating these coalitions with business owners is that you can get, you not only get these crony ties developing, but over time you can get the rise of political factions. And these political factions can challenge the incumbent regime. Financial globalization can enhance the potential threat of this faction in two ways. One, it allows these business owners to access international capital markets and thus escape the control of the incumbent political regime. Second, financial globalization increases the threat of a financial crisis, which may create the opportunity for this political faction to rise up and take control of the incumbent regime. In reaction to this, the regime has basically two options to defend itself. One option is to shut off access to international markets. But of course, if your regime depends upon economic growth, and thus depends on trade and international capital to enable growth to occur, then the legitimacy of your rule will come into question if you deny access to those international markets. So usually that's not an option. Unless, of course, you're willing to suppress your people very, very badly. At the same time, you shut off access to markets. But most regimes are not willing to do that. So the second option is more realistic and is the one more likely to be pursued. And that is the political authorities taking control of large businesses and getting that challenger, the political challenger, out of the way. And this is attractive for 3 reasons. First reason is that this creates a mechanism by which to reward loyal supporters of the regime. Second, it can deny opportunities to potential challengers. And third, it creates a steady income stream for the regime. So this is quite an attractive option, in fact. But the real question, given that it's so attractive, is whether the regime can actually do this. And whether the regime can actually accomplish this successfully depends on the type of regime. And so there are 2 attributes, I argue, that are critical to determining whether this can happen successfully. The first is whether the regime has centralized political control, as manifested by the number of veto points. So if the regime has few veto points, that is, few mechanisms by which to block the decisions that it makes, then it can very easily initiate the acquisition of large enterprises, because it doesn't have to worry about business owners blocking the regime from initiating its acquisition efforts. After all, they don't have any veto power. Second, does the regime have comprehensive institutional control? And by this, basically, I mean, does the political regime have the capacity to invite a wide number of new individuals into the regime's governance structure? And can it institutionalize mechanisms to co-opt the opposition through offering the transfer of rents, or the distribution of economic transfers, or even by producing credible intertemporal power sharing deals with the opposition? If it can do these things successfully, then the regime will be able to enhance its control over the key resources of the state and successfully acquire and incorporate these large enterprises into the regime's governance structure. And these 2 institutional attributes also help to stabilize the regime in the presence of a crisis. If there are few veto points, the regime can quickly transfer money to companies that are facing difficulties when the crisis hits. Likewise, the comprehensive institutional arrangements allow for the spreading of risk across numerous companies and the raising of revenue from numerous companies, and sending it quickly to where it's needed most. Non-one-party authoritarian regimes only have few veto points. They have weak institutional control. And so this makes it more difficult for them to acquire and successfully integrate large enterprises into their regime. So an example of the non-one-party authoritarian regime would be Suharto's Indonesia, for example, which was where all the large enterprises were owned by him and his family members. An example of a one-party regime would be Singapore, for example, or Malaysia. Finally, democracies. Democracies have many veto points, so as a result, it's difficult for them to quickly initiate state acquisitions. And of course, because there are many veto points in a democracy, these grant opportunities for business owners to block state acquisition initiatives. And of course, in the context of emerging economies, it's going to be business owners who are going to be especially powerful and wanting to block state acquisition initiatives. They do have comprehensive institutional arrangements, but you can see that when we put these 2 regime attributes together and we compare them across these 3 regime types, only one-party regimes have both of these institutional attributes that reduce the regime's vulnerability to financial globalization and help stabilize it through the use of state-owned corporations. So let me just show you a couple cases to illustrate the different responses. Malaysia a one-party regime in the Philippines, democracy. Both were hit badly by the Asian financial crisis. And you can see that they had very different responses, right? Almost opposite responses. In the wake of the Asian financial crisis, Malaysia increased the number of state-owned companies, while in the Philippines, they declined. And I'll just quickly present the data here for you. So state purchases stakes in non-SOE firms, so family-owned companies, basically, that were facing trouble. What happened to them? In Malaysia, 1/3 of all the family-owned companies in 1996 were bought by the state. That's a huge number. In the Philippines, there was a decline, which actually means family-owned companies bought previously state-owned companies. So you saw the reverse process happen. Newly listed state-owned companies in Malaysia, you had a large increase in these where the state retained an ownership stake. In the Philippines, it was tiny. And mergers and acquisitions by the state in Malaysia, much, much bigger, of course, than the Philippines. And just to give you a sense of the dynamics, what happened in Malaysia? Well, for example, Mahathir, he was being threatened by Anwar Ibrahim on the eve of the crisis, and because he was concerned about Anwar's capacity to challenge his rule, he got rid of him. He deposed him as finance minister, and companies allied to him and controlled by the state acquired many of the companies that were allied to Anwar Ibrahim, and those that were not acquired fell out of, their businesses suffered considerably, and many of them, most of them, are no longer prominent. So it's just an example. Another illustration of the rise of the state in the wake of the Asian financial crisis is the rise in sovereign wealth funds. Now you have to be careful when talking about sovereign wealth funds because they come in different varieties, right? One type are those that save for the future and pursue strategic investments, right? And these are found in Malaysia and Singapore. Malaysia's Khazanah and Singapore's Temasek. Another type engages in macro stability, right? That's Taiwan's sovereign stabilization fund. And in macro stability funds, the state is tied with regard to what it can do with that money. It doesn't have freedom to decide how those funds are invested. They're committed in a very specific way. And the same is true for foreign exchange reserve funds, which are found with Korea and Singapore's GIC. So the savings and strategic investment funds are the ones where the state has a lot of room for deciding how investments occur, and it's in Malaysia and Singapore where we see these, the one-party regimes. And what they're doing is increasing. You can see that since '96, this is just for 2008, foreign state ownership positions across the region have been increasing. And those which occur through sovereign wealth funds are primarily coming from Malaysia and Singapore. And you can see that these countries are the targets of where their investments are occurring. And so it's diversified. And the fact that it's so diversified is an indication of these sovereign wealth funds' desires to diversify their risk, right? Diversify out of their own domestic economies and diversify across the region. So this is a natural way of enhancing the stability of the regime. Okay, so two takeaway messages. The first is that the state is rising as a stabilizing counter-reaction to financial globalization, especially in one-party regimes. And the second is the rise of state control over important national resources contributes to the durability of one-party regimes in an era of financial globalization. And these are just some lessons that come out of the data from Southeast Asia. Thanks.
So we'll ask ask both of our panelists up to the stage, and then we'll start doing some question and answers. Absolutely.
I have a question. For myself, no, it's for you. So at the end you were talking about the importance of the middle class being a mechanism by which change could occur. But you were also at the same time talking about how it has been ineffective. But I'm just wondering, given that in many of these countries, most of these countries, democracy is new, and the middle class has not yet established organizations which allow it to overcome its collective action problem, thus act as a meaningful force of change. Is it really, can we really expect them? Are we hoping for too much to expect that the middle class could effect change? Do we need to wait?
No, I don't think it is, one can make the argument it's the middle class is not ready. In fact, if you can take a time sequence to this. If we look at the period of the 1990s, the 1990s, what was the most significant thing about the 1990s was the emergence of this new middle class. And if you look at the role of the middle class in terms of democratization, across the board, if you look at Indonesia, if you look at Taiwan, if you look at Korea, which are the other countries, Thailand, the middle class was in the forefront of change. So it was the middle class which has shown that they have the capacity to bring about, to take on the stage and bring about regime change. That's an important point. So why is it this middle class now, which is so well informed, this middle class which knows about what's happening within the political system, this middle class which understands what's going on in these countries, why isn't it being in the forefront of the change? I would argue that even in the 1990s in Malaysia, in Indonesia, one can even argue even in Singapore, this is a middle class that's very well informed. This is a middle class that understood what was happening in these economies. But they were not in the forefront of change at that time, precisely because there was economic growth. As Mahathir once said, very succinctly, if you have 10% economic growth annually, why do you want to talk about change? Who needs human rights, as he put it? If you have 10% annual growth rates, who needs human rights? He was right. Why should you change a system that's working? The real change occurred at a time of economic crisis. And when the middle class felt, okay, now we are being badly affected. And then you see them coming to the forefront and effecting this change. Now to come back to the more contemporary period, why does the new middle class need time to create institutions and to embed these institutions and only then they can take on the state? I don't think so. I don't think that's the reason why the middle class is not acting. I think the middle class is divided about where do we go from here. We are in a crisis. We agree after the 2008 global financial crisis, we do need change. If you look at Thailand, Thailand is clearly split. The middle class, the urban middle class is clearly split. If you look at Malaysia, you can see a split in terms of people who feel that we need to take the economy in a new direction and people who say, no, I don't want to move in this direction. I don't want, the new direction will mean greater state intervention. I don't want that. So here we have a middle class which I think is split, and that split is working in the interest of state elites. At least in the case of Malaysia, it's definitely working in the case of Singapore too. Singapore's problem also is the quality of the opposition. I do see now the middle class moving and trying to support the opposition, but whether they are really ready for change is a big issue. So my argument is, if you look at the elections, the election results clearly indicate this. Nations that are split, the middle class that are split. Who are the people who are really in the forefront of change, asking for change? Among the middle class. Students, university students. The university students are the ones who have got no direct link with the economy. They are still, free of being embedded in the economy. They don't have all these debts, at least I'm talking about Southeast Asia, I'm not talking about America. They don't have all these debts to worry about. They are talking about issues, they see the issues that are happening. Even today, you look at Malaysia, who is in the forefront of real debates about change? University students. Who was in the forefront of change in Indonesia? The students. They led the drive for change. And the students can take that stand because they have not got these deep roots in the economy yet. While as you look at the other middle class, they have got an interest in the economy. What does it mean to them in terms of their business interests, for example? Where will they stand in terms of business interests? What does greater regulation mean for them? Do they want greater regulation? What is the role of the state if the state is intervening more in the economy for them? Will they be crowded out in this system? What is this new model going to look like? Is itself a big debate. Where do we go from here? And where do we go from here when, as you've seen the figures, the state looms large in this economy? How do we grapple with that? So I think it's this divide in the middle class which has got its own vested interest too, and worrying about that, which seems to be the great divide that's happening here. How do we overcome these divides is the big debate we're talking about now in these countries.
Okay. And let's take some questions from the audience now. So are there any audience members that have questions? Yes.
Terence, how are you defining the middle class, especially in Asia? Having spent the last 2 years in Thailand, as you're probably aware, there doesn't really seem to be much of a middle class. And are you talking about the bureaucratic class, or are you talking about a sort of consumer class? Because those that are spending money in the malls, like we would be here, are not the people who are working, in McDonald's or working at Walmart, or, they're the people who are in government jobs, they're the people who have got military families. The people who are going to university are not the people who are going to university here, they're the people who are benefiting from patronage. They're the people who have got links to the deep state. Unless you're talking about areas that are traditionally poorer, up in Isan, you don't see them down in the south. You don't see them in Suratani and Padani, Yala, and places like that. So, are you using a different definition of the middle class than in Southeast Asia to what you'd be using in the West?
The definition of middle class is quite clear in terms of education, in terms of income. And I'm talking about middle class from that perspective. In fact, when I argue about middle class, who did I refer to? I talked about university students. I talked about an educated middle class, and I'm trying to make a distinction between the middle class who are deeply embedded in the economy and those who do not have that kind of embeddedness that we're talking about. I'm trying to talk about people who are benefiting, the middle class who are benefiting from the middle from a form of development which is neoliberal. And here, this will speak to even people who have economic interests. That we have wealth, we can define that in terms of income and wealth. Now, whether they will want to have that kind of change, I doubt it. Would they want to have greater regulation and greater intervention? No. If you're talking about a middle class of professionals, okay, they may be willing to consider it because they may mean different things to them. They don't have that kind of vested interest in the economy. They're not too worried about regulation, as say someone who is in business. So the middle class is not a homogeneous middle class. The middle class can be, as I said, deeply divided by activities. If you go down to the south, you can, or if you want to talk about different areas from spatial divide, landowners can constitute the middle class too, which these are not urbanized middle class too. They will also have their own interest in terms of what they want to protect when you talk about what is the state going to do. How would the middle class landowners, for example, feel about land reform? They want land reform. And land reform can be good, as we have seen in East Asia. One of the great success stories of East Asia was attributed to land reform. So when we talk about a middle class, as I made the point, get education, get income, look at wealth, these are the key indicators of middle class. Now, when you belong to each of these different categories, how would you view debates about the state? That's interesting to see. The business elite, the people who constitute the business class, where they stand on these issues. And they are powerful. They are far more powerful than the university students. they want greater taxation too, you know. I mean, who will agree to these kind of things? They have to have an agreement about these things. But if you look at most industrialized countries, look at Scandinavia, look at Australia, one of the issues there is about taxation in the high taxes, which the state needs to provide the social provision, because the state has a role to play in terms of protecting its citizens. That is the key issue here. The state must provide for social provision, because otherwise who takes care of these people who are disenfranchised when something happens? You know which country learned that the most? South Korea. South Korea was developing very well, they had great growth, great industrialization, and suddenly, as you saw from the figures that Richard showed you, the collapse. And when the collapse came, suddenly this middle class was disenfranchised. You see them walking in the streets, I've got no money, I've got no jobs, you saw that in Thailand too. You know. Who was there to help them out? Who was there to help them and help their kids? And you know what was the great lesson from Korea after the great financial crisis of 1997? The need to institute social provision, so that when we do have a crisis, the state has the capacity to move in and help people who are affected. But how do you do that? How do you do that? And one of the key issues is about taxation too. That also comes into the play. So these are the things that we need to look at when we talk about the middle class. Do not homogenize the middle class. Do not assume that the middle class are all on the same page. And as I said, that's why we have this middle class divide. The middle class are not the drivers of change that we saw, that drove the democratization process that we saw in the 1980s and 1990s. The big thing about the 1980s and 1990s was the role of the middle class in driving the change. Where are these drivers of change now? Why are they not changing? Now it's a different issue. Now we're not discussing democratization. Now we're talking about the economy and that will affect you directly in the pocket too. Now we're talking about the role of the state in the economy. To what extent do we allow for the state to be? Is it important? I say yes, it is. Yes, why should we be afraid of the state? Provided the state is accountable. Provided the state is transparent. Provided the state also can be checked. You cannot ask for greater state intervention when you have no democracy. The state will abuse that power. Whereas we have seen now, as we see in Malaysia, it's so clear what's happening. So these are the issues on the table that we need to consider when we talk about the reforming role of the middle class and why they are no longer making the reforms.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions from the audience?
Any question, don't worry, you can have a dialogue. You can have an opinion if you like. Share an opinion and then we'll just discuss the opinion.
Okay, this one will be for Professor Carney. As you sort of laid out how the governance of states affects the way their corporations are set up, but in a state like Thailand or Indonesia that's seen sort of a change in regime since the financial crisis, is there some level of the underlying corporate structure that makes states more vulnerable to that? Or is that purely a political thing that then would affect corporate governance later on? Or both?
So, thanks. Great question. I think the critical difference here, thanks for raising that question, because it's something I meant to say in the presentation, but I didn't get a chance to, I forgot to. One of the critical differences between Malaysia and Singapore versus Indonesia and Thailand is that in Indonesia and Thailand, corporations were predominantly family controlled. The state played a minor role in corporate affairs in comparison to Malaysia and Singapore. And that's a reflection of the institutionalization of the political parties that were controlling those Singapore and Malaysia. In Thailand and Indonesia, it was personalistic rule, right? And the main companies in those economies were owned by big families, not by the state, not by a political party. And so when change occurred, when there was the opportunity for change, in Indonesia and Thailand, the owners of the companies didn't try to block it. They allowed it to happen and then used the subsequent change to their advantage in the way that you talked about earlier within the context of democracy, right? More corruption at a more localized level with business owners using politicians to achieve whatever regulatory changes that they would prefer. But in the one-party regime, Malaysia and Singapore, the political regimes there had sufficient control over the major assets, the major resources of the state to block
Okay, so my question is concerning those nations that had state enterprises that owned the businesses, how do they deal with the moral hazard problem?
Yeah, so that's a great question. In Singapore, they have implemented hard budget constraints. Temasek has been pretty good about this. So it's a question of whether the state itself has the will to do this. And part of the capacity or part of the incentive that it has to do this depends upon the way it perceives itself and the constraints it faces with respect to the international economy, and whether the companies and the budget of the government can be maintained with or without a soft or hard budget constraint. So in Singapore, by necessity, it has to implement a hard budget constraint to maintain the fiscal, to maintain the government, the fiscal soundness of the government. In Malaysia, you tend to get more of a soft budget constraint, partly because you have more resources coming in from the abundance of oil and palm oil and other natural resources, but also because the political system allows for the regime to engage in patronage politics, and the state-owned companies are used to that end. So soft budget constraints are permitted.
I have a question on the GLCs, specifically in Asia. The interesting thing is, while I agree with your point about the pervasiveness of the GLCs and how the state has direct control of them as well as ownership, the fact is there's much debate about privatizing the GLCs. So how do you reconcile this idea of the state wanting to control these GLCs, but at the same time actually articulating and looking for people to take over these GLCs?
So what you see in Malaysia is you do see privatization, but the state almost always retains at least minority control. It almost never gives up total control. It always retains a piece. I've looked at the data, I know the data because I've been compiling the data on this for the past decade, over a decade in fact. And when Malaysia privatizes a company, when the government privatizes a company, it always keeps a small stake for itself. And that gives it a mechanism by which to influence the governance of that company. And so that would be my answer to you, is that the state still keeps a piece, an ownership stake in the company, while at the same time privatizing.
Actually, it's better than that.
Okay.
Not necessarily so in all sectors.
Okay.
In sectors where you want to keep control, we have what is known as the golden hand, the golden chair.
Okay.
The golden chair means as long as I have the golden chair, even if I give out 100% ownership to someone, I, as the government, I have the golden chair and retain the 10% as to what you can or cannot do. So what that means is actually there's no real privatization going on here. Real privatization means a complete divestment. The government in some cases has divested completely. In sectors like agriculture, certain industries, they're not really interested in completely. But when it comes to financial sectors or key industries like car sector, they don't handle or what they do. So the state can also be selective in terms of how they privatize. And even when you do privatize, they have a golden share which they can keep and use to protect so-called these industries. Like the National Airlines, they had a golden share of National Airlines, always was privatized.
So I would just quickly add that what seems to be happening here, and this is not necessarily totally true, but Malaysia to some degree and China as well seem to be following the Singapore
perception. I mean, when you take this is based on perception, you have a problem here. You know, it's not based on facts. Depends who you talk to. When I look at Malaysia too, and I look at TI and what he has said, I tell TI people, I've told this to TI people, this is no reflection of reality. How you go about collecting your data, you present this data, and then you make conclusions that corruption has fallen or corruption has increased. So I don't take those things too seriously. I have worked with TI. I've been a consultant to TI. I've seen how they've done it. And I think there are major flaws in terms of how they compile the data. What it can show is, okay, according to these perceptions, we have seen the rise and fall in reflects how society is thinking. But sometimes it depends, as I said, who you talk to. So I can't really give you an answer to that question. Because I'd have to look at the data and see what you're saying, and then, okay, on what basis do you make this argument? What happened to the Bible? I can't tell. But I wouldn't use TI as my basis for drawing the major conclusions of what's happening in the economy. So be careful with TI. Don't use it as your primary basis for trying to make some arguments for what's happening in the economy, what's also happening in the state.
I believe we have time for one more question from the audience before we have to wrap things up. So do we have one more question? Do we have any from this side? Because I feel like this side of the hall has been dominating the conversation. So I see some, I want to get everyone involved as much as possible.
How about this guy?
I guess, let's go ahead.
So I just want to, I don't mean to belabor a point, but I'm a little bit interested to talk further about the middle class issue. Sorry. But one issue I think that's really interesting in this regard is the capacity for the state or different groups to co-opt the middle class. And this has emerged, I think, particularly in an important way through efforts to privatize companies. This happened in Singapore in the mid-1980s. And the regime, Temasek in particular, sold off ownership in some of the state-owned companies, specifically targeting middle-class Singaporeans to buy these shares in order to get them to have a vested interest in the PAP regime, right, and in the success of the state-owned companies and the economy generally. And you can imagine that in other contexts, certain groups would target middle-class investors in order to get their support or to get them to be compliant with whatever that particular group's agenda is for financial reasons, and thus co-opt them and prevent them from staging a protest. Do you have any thoughts on that? And so when you talk about the middle class, I guess maybe what we need to identify is which part of the middle class is not co-opted by the incumbent regime.
When you talk about listing a company on the stock exchange, it's a mechanism to which you can also get rich very quickly. We have the term IPO, initial public offer. If you get the IPO, that means you buy the shares before they're actually listed. And then when it's listed, usually there's a hike in the price. You make a lot of money. It's a good way of making money. So you subscribe to the shares as soon as they're listed. You get it at a par value. As soon as it's listed, the market value shoots up and then you make a lot of money. It's a good way, as you say, to allow some middle class to get rich, to make some money. But whether it is co-optation, I'm not too sure. Because once it's already publicly listed, you're dictated by the market. Share prices, as we know, can go up or can fall. One of the things we have found out about the stock market is that the stock market hasn't really changed all that much since 1997. If you look at the period between 1990s, from 1990 until about 1995, 96, you will see a lot of people investing in the stock market. There's a boom of people who are making money out of this. After 1997, it's no longer the trend. Look at the stock market and where it stands in 1997 compared to where it stands today in terms of growth. It's not much, it's not changed. yes, you can co-opt them by giving them shares, but okay, it's a form of investment. Where do the middle class invest in now? Anyone? Property. Property is the new wealth thing. Property prices in Singapore, go to Singapore and get the property prices now. The big thing is about escalation in property prices, the big thing in Malaysia. Property, there is an appreciation in value, it's not dictated. There is an appreciation in value over the years. Whether it's a bubble or not, I do think it's a bubble. But there is still an escalation in value of property prices, and you can make returns from investments in property. That is not the case so much in the stock market. The stock market has not been rising, so that the returns of your investments in the stock market is such that they can look at and say, okay, I'm co-opted, I'm happy, I want to be part of the system. I don't think it's what's happening from the middle class in Singapore. It's definitely not the case in terms of historical information, especially if you look in terms of the escalation of price too. Singapore has got a tightly regulated market economy, and the volume of investments and speculation on the stock market is not like the type you can see in other countries too, which will allow for this too. So that's the other thing too, the level of regulation of these prices, which will allow for those prices to rise. Singapore, as I said, does not have a market where people look at the stock market and say, well, this is great. It was definitely not the case in the 1990s. The countries that were looking for the stock market was really shooting up: Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, South. And then the crisis happened. And then we began to realize the problem of speculation on the stock market. You can make money, but you can lose it also very quickly. So, privatizing, getting them to buy the shares, yes, they can get some returns on investment. Is it a major tool for co-optation? To my mind, no. And remember this, the GLCs are still controlled by the state. The state is not entrepreneurial. The state is not entrepreneurial in the sense you can see massive increase in the share prices also because they are really on the ascendancy because they are high entrepreneurial company moving up in terms of capturing market share and so on and so forth. It's not how we think. It's not how we operate. Entrepreneurialism is to be found in privately owned firms. Singaporeans are not really into this system. Middle class is not really into this system. So my point to you is that I can see that stock market is a form of co-optation. Where you do check the middle class, where you do control the middle class, and they say during the election, your property. You won't provide services in your area. You don't vote for us, why should we provide services in your area? It will affect their property. That's how they discipline the middle class, through their property, not through the stock market. Listen to the debates, during the election. Singapore is very interesting. You go after them depending on the area where they live. And people want their property prices to go up too. So, okay, you'll come home, state take care of property.
Okay. So with that, we close tonight's event. So I want to thank Professors Carney and Gomez for sharing their knowledge and insight with us. And so before I forget some closing announcements, I forgot to mention this at the beginning, but on your seats you will have seen like a survey. We're doing surveys of our last events for the winter quarter so that we can determine what events you're interested in and create even better ones in the future, and also to potentially secure funding from the school so that we can put some serious food in the back there for everyone. So, and also don't forget next Tuesday, Maz Jobrani, 1 o'clock to 2:30 here in the Great Hall. Be sure to register online. Next Thursday, former Mexican ambassador to China, discussing China's incursion into Latin America. And don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and our new blog page. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you for your questions. Thank you, professors, for speaking. And we'll see you next time at the forum.